Okay, before we begin with this workshop, just a couple of disclaimers at the top, 5 to be exact. The first is just things that I'm not going to talk about in this workshop, just a couple of things I want to get out of the way. The first is this is primarily focusing on long-term relationships and the effect on more serious relationships within given debate motions, and so I'm not going to really discuss all that much, although I will mention dating apps and go into dating apps in some detail. But I'm not going to talk that much about arguments with regards to the sort of motions that sometimes arise around hookup culture and that sort of thing. Second, I'm also not going to talk about media depictions of love. We'll get there in the media section, but not something I'm planning to go over right now. And third, I'm also not going to talk about the sort of choose-your-own-adventure relationship motions that come up. So things like this house as Odysseus would stay on Calypso's island, this house as Jordan would object to the marriage, this house would stay in a committed monogamous relationship with the worm, etc. These are all very fun motions. And you probably can use, in fact, I think in all of those settings, the motions I've talked about so far, you can use some of the takeaways from this workshop, but especially these ones, they're highly specific and they're a little less connected to sort of relationship dynamics, which will be the primary focus of this workshop. We will, however, cover these in practice possibly, so be prepared for that. 3 other disclaimers. First, none of the things that I say here are my personal opinion. They're not representative of my past experiences. They are just things that can be used for debate. Second, this is not relationship advice. And the final thing is just content warning. We will talk about abusive relationships inside of this topic area. It will be somewhat brief because, we'll talk about that when we get to it. Okay. There are 2 sorts of technical things that it is good to have familiarity with for debates in regards to relationships. The first is marriage, prenuptials, and divorce. Specifically, I'm going to give you a basis for approaching all of those things that is very US-centric, but some of the principles and broader stuff you can kind of cast out past just the US as well. So marriage is a civil legal status. It requires you have the capacity to marry, mutual consent and compliance with the state's formalities, so a license, vows, etc., depending on what the states require. Primarily, marriage is governed by state law. However, it does have federal importance. First thing that it has federal importance for is tax filing. Very obviously, you file your taxes, your federal taxes, differently if it is the case that you are married. It also just gives you a large list of benefits where marital status is considered as a factor. So, for example, estate planning, you can transfer unlimited assets without gift taxes to someone you're married to. Spouses are typically allowed to be added to employee benefits and stuff like that. So there's a large list of benefits, of financial benefits that come from being married. However, the majority of the stuff surrounding it is governed by state law. Additionally, religious and social norms are deeply ingrained in marital institutions. So in the US, while ceremonies have no real legal status and laws are decided by the state and federal government rather than religious bodies, this is not true in every part of the world. Many countries adopt a mixed legal regime. So, for example, India has religion-specific personal laws and also a secular civil marriage route across religion or caste lines. Many other countries primarily recognize religious or customary marriage. So, for example, Israel, where marriage and divorce are typically handled through religious authorities. People who don't want to do that typically have to get married abroad and then seek registration inside of Israel. Some countries recognize civil unions as a less socially loaded and sometimes legally different alternative to marriage. So I believe EU competencies require that, but this, I don't know if that's for sure the case. I believe it is, but it's definitely the case in a lot of European states that in many instances they offer civil unions as an alternative to marriage. Polygynous marriage, while it is not recognized in the US, is frequently legal as well. Generally, this is one man with multiple wives. Divorce. Divorce begins when one spouse files a petition or a complaint in a court. The other spouse is then, quote-unquote, served. Divorce proceedings in the US typically determine the following things. First, how property and debts are divided. Second, whether either spouse owes continuing support to the other. And third, parental rights or responsibilities for children. On property and debt division, most states distinguish between community and separate property. States differ, but separate property generally includes property owned before marriage, gifts, inheritances that were kept separate via prenuptials or just based on the inheritance stipulations. Marital property generally includes any earned assets that were acquired during marriage. Some states use community property rules. So, for example, Arizona, California, Texas, Washington, New Mexico, and a couple of others, where spouses are treated as equally sharing community property. Most other states, and most states in general, use equitable distribution. So courts divide community property in a way that is deemed fair by the court. Debt is also divided at the point of divorce. Children. Courts distinguish 4 things with regards to children. First, legal custody, that is, who has the decision-making authority, so decisions like medical care, mental health treatment, etc. The default and most common arrangement is joint legal custody, so one parent cannot independently change the child's school, for example. In highly conflictual divorces, joint legal custody is frequently a continuance governance dispute, which takes time and money from both parents and the child, as parents frequently return to court over small things like vaccination decisions, therapy, sports participation, relocation, etc. So courts generally reject this model when parental conflict looks as though it will likely be extreme, opting for sole legal custody, where one parent has primary authority as a decision maker, but the other parent still gets information and maintains visitation rights. Second, physical custody is decided, so that is where the child lives. Third, visitation rights. Fourth, any owed child support. And additionally, modern US family law prioritizes the best interests of the child. This is a change from the family law regime a while ago. Because divorce generally takes months and sometimes years, the court frequently uses temporary orders to decide things like who stays in the home, who pays the bills, who has temporary custody of children, and to protect spouses in instances where allegations of domestic violence exist before the court can ensure whether or not these allegations are true. Contested divorces require far more court time. Frequently, they require the hiring of experts, and they're generally far more expensive than uncontested divorces, where both figures agree generally on splitting up and splitting assets or liabilities. When figures own hard to evaluate assets, so for example, a business, there can be valuation disputes, which are frequently also very expensive. Similarly, children sharply increase costs because custody litigation is fact-intensive and frequently very emotionally intense for both figures, because obviously you are deeply emotionally invested in your child. Divorce can frequently be weaponized in abusive relationships in the lead up and during the divorce proceedings. If one figure has a monetary advantage such that they can afford a war of attrition for far longer than the other figure, this can act as a bar to divorce in the first place, and it can make divorce ruinous for the disadvantaged figure. It's worth noting that most states allow judges to order one spouse to contribute to the other's legal fees, especially when there is a major income disparity or one party is acting particularly maliciously, so for example, needlessly prolonging litigation. It's also worth noting, however, that most people are not particularly legally fluent and may well not know this in the lead up and during the divorce proceedings, although during the divorce proceedings frequently you do figure out this sort of thing because you have a lawyer involved and that sort of stuff. Even when it's not being weaponized, divorce can be financially ruinous for one or both parties. People frequently spend very large sums of time and money litigating over issues which have a very, very small objective value. Why might people make irrational decisions like this? Well, divorce is frequently intensely emotionally charged. It involves betrayal. It involves your perceived status. It involves lots and lots of humiliation, fear, and potentially even wants for revenge against your partner. Divorce itself, as a result of all of this, is intensely psychologically draining and frequently very traumatic for people who undergo it. Knowing that divorce is frequently very expensive, on average costing $12,000 to $17,000, and realizing that it confers many financial benefits, many people nominally get divorced while still being legally married. So divorce rates as a result are somewhat underreported. Despite this, in the United States, 41% of first marriages end in divorce, 60% of second marriages, and 73% of third marriages. So why are divorce rates so high? One reason is just that divorces become more accessible over time, both mentally and legally. You no longer have to prove cause to get divorced. You can be more certain of a more fair division of assets, etc. Second, marriage has shifted over time. In many older marital systems, marriage was deeply anchored by necessity, religious obligation, and a lack of social mobility, and also a far more intense social pressure to stay in the relationship. Existing expectations have far more to do with a fulfillment of your higher order needs. So for example, intimacy, sexual compatibility, etc. And our needs are not static things. So you change immensely over the course of even 10 years. This lack of existential pressure paired with an emphasis on ever-changing attributes means that divorce has just become far more common and normal. Prenups. What are prenups? Prenups are contracts that two marrying people sign prior to marriage, which predetermines, subject to contract law. If you want to read about contract law, see a document that I've linked. But it predetermines what counts as marital property, how assets and liabilities are allocated, and whether spousal support is owed. The most common functions are protecting premarital assets, protecting family wealth or inheritances, and preserving your business ownership. Prenups are only enforceable if a number of conditions are satisfied, and a lot of these extend pretty directly from contract law. So again, read up on that document if you want to learn more about these. But first is just voluntary entry. So for example, prenups cannot be presented mere days before a wedding because that puts intense pressure on you to sign the prenup. Publicly threatening cancellation if a prenup isn't signed generally renders it void. Again, that feels as though you're being pressured into signing the prenup. There must also be full financial disclosure, so both parties must know the full financial situation of their counterpart at the point that they decide to enter into a prenup. And the agreement cannot be unconscionable. So, and this is somewhat of a up to the court standard, although obviously it has a vast legal doctrine that stands behind it and decides where that is, but unconscionable by itself doesn't mean all that much. Just, for example, one spouse lacked legal counsel or enforcement would produce destitution for one spouse are instances in which it might be deemed an unconscionable agreement to follow through on or unconscionable in design. It's worth saying that prenups do not only matter for the ultra-rich. Frequently they are used by middle-class couples around things like student debt, family homes, retirement accounts, or stipulations with regards to children from prior relationships. They can be a source of stability for relationships where there may otherwise be concerns about things like future inheritance disputes, and in good faith they make the divorce process much smoother if it has to occur in the first place. Since prenups require full financial disclosure, they can frequently just be good as conversation starters about fiscal planning and as creating forced financial transparency between partners. Plausibly, given that prenups are frequently signed at a healthy point in the relationship, they protect disadvantaged partners from being strong-armed in court proceedings at the point that the relationship has turned against them. However, prenups rarely get rid of litigation risk. Very frequently, couples still have litigation wars over interpretation, whether or not the prenup is legitimate in the first place, or whether the circumstances have changed dramatically in a way that nullifies considerations. We'll talk about this a bit later, but it's also worth noting that prenups are generally signed at the height of the honeymoon phase, where power imbalances are particularly emphasized, and people are likely to not consider long-term ramifications on them, given that they just are over the moon for their partner. They want to do as much as possible for them. The second technical thing that you should have a grip on for relationships debates are just dating apps. These come up every once in a while. Dating app algorithms look to optimize engagement. Why does engagement matter for dating apps? 3 primary reasons. First, the more engaged that you are, the more you contribute data to improving the recommendation system that the dating app uses. Second, a completely disengaged user is just unlikely to make in-app purchases, to upgrade their subscription, etc. And third, many dating apps rely on advertisement revenue, as you probably know, and engagement increases the number of ads that you run into. So as a result, dating apps have somewhat paradoxical incentives. Users try to use them with the hopes of not using them because they want to get off of the dating app and have a long and fulfilling relationship, yet dating apps want to keep users on them for as long and as much as possible. How do algorithms optimize for engagement? First, users explicitly narrow their pool of candidates. For example, age range, gender, sexuality, distance, religion in some instances, lifestyle preferences, etc. Second, historically, some apps used ELO systems. So, for example, early Tinder users who received the most right swipes were ranked higher, effectively chess ELO-like, allowing the system to rank desirability. And as a result, those users saw their profiles shown to more people. Currently, systems rely far more on machine learning recommendation models, which infer behavior from data such as who you swipe on, how quickly you swipe on them, who swipes on you, who replies, how long conversations last, whether phone numbers get exchanged, whether dates are likely, whether users remain active afterward, and a large host of other things that data can be tracked from. Apps then build a behavioral profile of you, which decides how often you get recommended to people, which people you get recommended to, and who gets recommended to you. For example, if you consistently linger on profiles with outdoorsy pictures, you'll probably get recommended more of those. This creates a sort of desirability stratification, where highly desirable users get more visibility in matches, while low desirability users may receive less exposure or be shown primarily to one another. Rather obviously, apps also have strong incentives to not make low desirability users feel completely hopeless, as they'll eventually give up and leave the platform if that's the case. So sometimes platforms boost particularly desirable users to be seen by people who are likely to never be matches for them, just to increase engagement. Okay, that's all on the sort of technical things that are involved in these debates. Let's talk about some relationship dynamics. First, let's go over all of the ways that relationships can be good for you. One, you have someone who deeply understands you. You feel that you can be open to them. You have a large sum of shared experiences. You share your emotions, your deep thoughts, your worries with them. Your happiness compounds with theirs. Your sadness feels less sad because you can process and be told that things are all right. In the instances that you don't share, this acts as a sharing of its own. Your partner is used to you sharing, and therefore they ask you what's wrong. You're given the opportunity to share things that you otherwise wouldn't with people who are not as aware of your sort of tendencies there. It is also just good to have someone who you can be vulnerable to help you through the hardest decisions in life, to comfort you when you feel like you're worrying over nothing, to share the small aspects of your life with, the things that make you happy on a day-to-day basis. We all want to be heard, and it's amazing to know for certain that you have someone who cares and will always listen to you. Vulnerability itself leads to reciprocated vulnerability. They feel safer, and so they do the same for you. Frequently, this sort of intimacy can align your expectations with your partner. So, for example, maybe your partner doesn't feel shut out because they have an expectation that they haven't felt as though they had the safe space to disclose, or vice versa. And this provides you with a deeper knowledge of each other, the needs that you might have that you think are silly that they might adjust to because they care about you. You trust each other deeply, which builds confidence in the relationship. Additionally, self-acceptance just becomes considerably easier when someone else accepts you. Talking through things instead of bottling them up is obviously far better. And there are many things that you only feel comfortable talking through with your partner. And so frequently there are a lot of conversations that are exclusively ones that you can hold if you're in a relationship with someone who you deeply trust and are willing to have these conversations with. Finally, you also feel seen and understood, which just fulfills a basic psychological need of most humans. Second, relationships provide a physical sense of security. You can take career risks with work while knowing that you have emotional and financial support. Moving to a new place feels less overwhelming, even if they don't move with you, because you know that you can talk through all of the difficulties that you run into during that. But presumably, if they do move with you, then very clearly that is considerably less overwhelming because you have someone else who you are comfortable with already there helping you out the entire time. You always know that you have a shoulder to cry on, etc. Third, they give you a sense of meaning and importance, so you're someone else's go-to person, someone else is your go-to person. Early life is rather linear, so you go to high school, you go to college, you get a job, but later life frequently loses that sense of linearity. Many professions are low mobility, jobs stall out for long periods of time, and relationships do fix this. So you hit certain anniversaries, you might get engaged, you might get married, you might have kids, your kids might hit landmark ages, your kids might follow the sort of school to college to job path, which adds milestone events to your personal life. You can build a family with them, which gives you meaning regardless of whether or not you hit these milestone events, because you have other people who you see as continuances of yourself. Obviously, additionally, being in a relationship gives you access to physical intimacy, so sex very obviously, but also just human touch, so hugs, someone to run their hand through your hair, etc., which is frequently quite difficult to get from other places because it is generally stigmatized in a large number of social settings. Fifth, they give you financial stability and benefits. So tax breaks obviously in the instance of being married, but also just lower rent and utilities and fixed living costs. So for example, pots and pans type shit. Second, why might a relationship be bad for you? The first reason is just that you're constantly around your partner, and so while this frequently is good for you because it gives you shared life experiences, on the flip side it can also be quite bad because annoying things build up over time. Their infuriating habits start to get on your nerves over time in a way that they don't over a short period. You have no time to cool off after they bug you, and as a result, it is very easy to induce spirals of negativity because you're around each other constantly, because you cannot take as much space as you need to cool off and then have conversations that are important, because the small things that they do that annoy you build up over time to the point where you hit a breaking point and you lash out against them, or you hold a conversation that is somewhat at odds with one another instead of trying to resolve the thing, and that spirals and they feel upset, etc. Second, as much as you open yourself up to intense positivity, you also open yourself up to deep heartbreak and emotional trauma at the point that the relationship falls through. Maybe your partner dies, maybe something horrific happens, and you are emotionally traumatized for the rest of your life. And the feelings that we can feel here are particularly intense in many instances. Third, you just expend lots of emotional energy. You care about the things that your partner does, about their emotions, about their wants. All of these weigh on you deeply. You feel bad when they are unfulfilled, and you feel even worse when you contributed to the fact that they feel unfulfilled, or them being disappointed because you didn't do something that you meant to do, or that you didn't know they expected you to do. Couples fight, even in healthy relationships, and frequently those fights are intensely emotionally exhaustive because you each care immensely about one another, and yet you have this sort of thing that you cannot come to terms over quite easily, and it is genuinely quite emotionally difficult to go through that. The more time and emotional intimacy that you invest in a relationship, the more a potential breakup feels potentially devastating and weighs on you prior to it happening. In any instance where you feel like your partner might be considerate or considering it, or in any instance where it just happens to come to mind for you, for example, you feel that you always have to be there for them, which leads to, in many instances, just emotional burnout, especially when you don't have the emotional capacity to always be their support person in every instance where they need support, yet you feel like you have to be there because you are the person who is supposed to be there. Small mistakes that you make in the context of the relationship, so for example, things like forgetting about a special day or just double scheduling, have a huge weight to them because they can affect the entirety of the relationship. Fourth, there's just a very real opportunity cost, so you lose out on sexual or romantic experimentation because it is genuinely somewhat difficult to experiment with your partner in many instances. It is quite difficult to broach vulnerable and judgment-ridden conversations about things that are maybe stigmatized with someone whose perspective of you matters so intensely and deeply to you, and literally does matter in the sense that their perspective of you is probably physically important to you. Additionally, your independence in life planning goes out the window. You cannot do things like uproot your life on a whim, take job opportunities that are halfway across the country that you live in without consulting someone who will be deeply affected by them. You can't make high-risk, high-reward choices at work. You cannot make big purchases on things that you might want to make big purchases on. Also, if sex or physicality becomes a chore, that, like, for example, maybe you aren't really into it, you feel as if it is just something that is expected, or is something that your partner will be upset about if you don't, or you're just afraid of them feeling as though you're falling out of love, and therefore you force yourself to do these sorts of things. In many instances, this one leads to you losing out on the base psychological need that you were getting access to in the first place. B, frequently you feel irritated by the things that you have to do in a way that you feel that you cannot tell them because you don't want them to feel as though you're falling out of love with them, which builds up immensely over time. And C, given that most relationships are pretty exclusive, you frequently cannot get this need met somewhere else. The fifth thing is just that frequently relationships lead to dependence, that is both financially in the sense that oftentimes you end up with joint finances, or financial dependence because of career sacrifices or lower earnings that one partner has to take on, or just emotionally to the extent that you isolate yourself from your friends because it is just far easier to share things with this one person who knows you so closely, who it is natural to talk to, etc. And therefore you become reliant on them emotionally and develop emotional dependence over time. Why might we enter relationships? One reason is just a fear of loneliness. It is somewhat sad to be by yourself, especially if you've been in a committed relationship before. You see your friends in happy or happy-looking relationships. You miss or want the intimacy. It is difficult to not have someone who you can process your deepest feelings to. Second, sex, obviously. Sex is a basic psychological driver for rather obvious evolutionary reasons. It is highly glorified in the media. It releases chemicals that make you feel indescribably good, and also just have other health benefits like promoting deeper sleep. Third, relationships are intensely romanticized by media, by your friends, and the stories that your family tells you. You perceive only the best portion of other people's relationships. So, for example, the things they post on Instagram, the portions that make their way into conversations in later life. Fourth, there are just strong social and evolutionary pressures to form a family, and very obviously this is a precursor. The reason that I'm going over all of this is just because many relationships debates ask you to make a trade-off between relationships and other things. So, for example, this house opposes the narrative that love is about sacrifice, or this house supports the norm of prioritizing one's career over things like forming a family and young adult life, etc. This gives you analysis to paint relationships out as good or bad. As a tip, Do weighing against the other side, acknowledging their strengths, and explaining why you still went out over them. It also may be strategic in some relationships debates, which appear to have a trade-off in the number of people who are getting into relationships to marginalize that trade-off in the first place. Let's talk about the 3 stages of relationships, that is, entering relationships, the broad length of relationships that happens in between entering and exiting relationships. Entering relationships first. There are lots of good reasons that you fall in love. Maybe it is that your partner gives you a unique feeling of safety and security. Maybe they are uniquely attuned to and adept at fulfilling your needs. Maybe you just have so many cherished shared memories prior to the relationship that you slowly fall for each other. There are also lots of bad reasons that we may fall in love. So you may not actually fall in love with your partner, but rather how your partner admires or sees you, how they boost your self-esteem. You may fall in love with a mentally idealized version of your partner. You may fall in love because of a desire to master previous negative situations. So for example, maybe you had distant parents or a distant previous relationship and you want the chance to feel as though you are winning in that past context by finding and fixing a relationship with a new distant person. Maybe it is just that we feel safe in situations that are familiar to us. So you know what it is like for this to be the case. You develop defense mechanisms. It aligns with your personal sense of self. Maybe if your parents were distant or abusive in some way, you're as a result drawn to the same sort of relationships just out of a simple sense of security because you know what it is like to be in them. Maybe you don't believe that you're lovable in the first place. You don't pursue good and healthy relationships. Maybe you're just bored or lonely and you desire drama. Maybe it's that you have a savior complex, so maybe you date addicts because you want to be the one who stops their addiction. Maybe you feel emotionally devastated from a recent breakup and you re-enter the dating market too quickly to avoid those feelings, to have someone that you can just move forward with without reflecting on the hurt that you feel in the present. So these are all reasons that you can fall in love with someone, regardless of whether or not it is good or bad. Let's talk about a number of characteristics that define this stage of a relationship. First, you have highly limited information. So it is frequently taboo to have horribly deep conversations when you first meet someone as to the sorts of things that you want to get out of the relationship, the sorts of deal breakers that might come up in the future, and that sort of thing. You just want to present a sort of best version of yourself, and so maybe there are red flags that you have that you try to keep hidden under the table during the first few dates that you go on or something like this. You don't know how it is that you will solve conflict together when conflict arises, so you just have a lack of information as to how you will work through things with your partner. You don't know each other's tendencies, you don't know each other's trauma, etc. Second, the relationship is fun, it is exciting, it is new. Even in rebound relationships, frequently, relationships get stale or worse towards the end. So, for example, maybe sex isn't as fun because in the back of your mind, you're concerned about the potentiality of breaking up. People preemptively emotionally distance themselves. Physical touch takes on different connotations or gets old. This is a new person that you get to figure out. Someone with new intricacies. Their hands feel different. They have different habits. They have different quirks, etc. The novelty itself is exciting, and as a result, your judgment is impaired. You want it to work out. You want to be optimistic about it, and you see and experience only the best parts of your partner, again, because these are frequently the parts that they bring to the table at the start of relationships. And you observe all of this with rose-colored glasses, so even if there are red flags, you probably ignore them. Love is felt most intensely during this period, compounded by uncertainty and excite regarding the new relationship. And as a result, you're very willing to overlook the sorts of negative interactions that might occur. So, for example, maybe they make you jealous in some instances. Maybe there are toxic interactions, but you write these off as things that are infrequent, unimportant, because you are so excited and uncertain about the future with them. Third, this stage of the relationship is just characterized by you starting to make trade-offs, which kind of snowball over time. So you spend less time around your friends. As your partner takes up more of your time, you have to adjust to making decisions with them included in the thought process, etc. Second stage, during the relationship. What are the primary characteristics that define this stage of the relationship? First, the original excitement of the relationship fades into routinity. And this can plausibly lead to disillusionment and tension as the thrill of the start of something new somewhat fades away. And it is just true that sometimes people are primarily in love with that feeling and not with each other. But in many instances, this is just fine. You move past it and you realize that this is the natural course of the relationship. Second, the depth of commitment increases. So you accumulate shared experiences. Your partner brings you lots and lots of comfort. The relationship becomes your new normal. You invest time, emotional bandwidth, and money into each other over time. Third, this is a stage where large obstacles can appear, both in the sense that small things compile over time, and in the sense that maybe differences in relationship aspirations begin to make their way into the available pool of knowledge for both partners here. Or maybe one partner just has to choose between sacrificing major opportunities or potentially imperiling the relationship. Fourth, it both becomes harder and easier to communicate at the same time, so you grow accustomed to and comfortable with one another. Conversations become more fluid. You realize what each other does when they are hurting and don't want to let the other person know. And at the same time, however, since everything is routinized, there's inertia in the way of communicating any want for change. It becomes difficult to express a want for more excitement in your life, yet this is directly as these things build up and take their emotional toll on you, which means that proper communication in these contexts is particularly important, because if you cannot communicate properly with your partner, these sorts of things will just boil up and flow over eventually. The final stage of the relationship, leaving the relationship. Why might relationships fail? This is obviously a non-exhaustive list, and I should have flagged this for the entering into relationships. Both of those were very obviously non-exhaustive as well. First, it's just maybe there is a fundamental incompatibility between your wants. So, for example, maybe you want to get married and your partner doesn't. Maybe you want kids, your partner knows that they do not want kids. Maybe it is the case that a breach of trust occurs, so maybe your partner cheats on you. Maybe your life circumstances get in the way, so maybe you just need to move away from one another and don't want to undergo the difficulties of long-distance relationships. Failures of communication can also lead to this sort of thing. So, for example, different love languages or needs. Frequently, it is difficult to ask your partner for what you need from them because you feel as though it is an imposition. You feel a little grieved that they haven't already recognized this as a need, and you probably have done small things to indicate as such that you feel should be obvious to them. And as a result, two people can genuinely put a lot of work into prioritizing one another in a relationship, but never notice it because their love languages don't match up, or they're prioritizing the wrong things, and feel, as a result, underappreciated. Additionally, most people model their understanding of serious relationships off of their most proximate experience of serious long-term relationships. For some, this is a past relationship, but for most people, this is your parents' relationship. You believe that what your parents did is normal, but parents have very different relationships, and as a result, you can frequently have silent differences in expectations for how you should approach them. There are any number of other hidden expectations that can also just come up that can frequently ruin relationships. These are obviously rather minor examples of it, and frequently it looks like a lot of these occurring over a period of time and having bad communication tactics or not understanding yourself to the extent that you realize that these are hidden expectations. But for example, it might look like one partner valuing Valentine's Day and another partner not. It might look like one partner caring intensely about their birthday being a particular way and the other partner failing to fulfill that. Or it might look like just not understanding how each other wants to divide work, etc. For the record, this is why things like therapy are very, very important in even healthy relationships, because they facilitate the necessary conversations to avoid downward spirals, and they also give you access to someone who can very much dig deep into you personally in a way that you frequently cannot do. Some characteristics of this phase. The primary thing to say is just that leaving relationships is intensely difficult and painful, and that is regardless of the depth of dependence that you and this person may have developed on each other in almost all instances. One reason for this is just sunk cost, so you put immense amounts of effort in, you've sacrificed and given up on many opportunities. For example, potential ins for other relationships, job offers, small sacrifices like spending the evening with them when you had other things you might have wanted to do, etc. And you have been less in contact with your friends, so you don't want all of these things that you have done to be in vain, and as a result, you try to retroactively justify your decisions by staying in the relationship, even when you know that it is doomed or it's bad for you. Because leaving would be acknowledging the fruitlessness of the last years of your life. Second, fear of the unknown. So even if you're unhappy in the relationship, you know what it's like to be in the relationship. It is comfortable, it's known, and you haven't been single in a very long time. The unknown of all of that is intensely scary. You think that even though the relationship might be bad or not great, being alone must be worse, and you're scared of the possibility of it being worse. Third, breaking up itself is quite painful. You feel guilty and sad for causing someone you probably still care immensely about this much pain. You know that you will feel sad about breaking up. You know or think that you will miss them in the long run. And you feel all of this preemptively. And as a result, you wish for and try to force things to be different when maybe they can't be. Second, obviously, the depth of dependence compounds these factors. So financial reliance may mean it is literally infeasible for you to leave the relationship. Emotional dependence and isolation makes you afraid of life without them. And their level of integration into your life makes this even more difficult. So you have more people that you have to justify this decision to, etc. The setup for the post-relationship period, though not something I'll talk about particularly in depth here, is worth noting as something that matters, because there is a very real chance of financial or psychological instability in the aftermath of a relationship. And so setting up the post-relationship period is something that is worth considering in some debates. Okay, this gives us all of the tools to impact and weigh effects on all three areas. So first, why might entering a relationship plausibly be more important than other areas? At least three reasons. The first is just because it is easier to intervene before a relationship begins. Other phases have an inertia which is difficult to work against, and so it is far easier to just ensure that people enter into good relationships in the first place more often than it is to intervene in bad relationships. Second, this is logically prior to other phases, so there is no real reason to sustain relationships unless we enter into good ones in the first place. Third, it is difficult to make good judgment, and as a result, it is therefore important to intervene in this situation. So, for example, to promote relationships formed in ways that lead to healthiness, but also because you are uniquely vulnerable at this stage to the extent that you have the least information and are willing to make the largest sacrifices. And so making sure that people don't put themselves in particularly bad situations is very important. On the flip side of this, you can also say that because it is so difficult to make good judgment, this is the most difficult stage to intervene in. It is difficult to get people to make rational decisions because this is inherently an irrational part of the relationship process. Second, during the relationship, why is this plausibly the most important? The first is just that it is the largest impact. So these are the things that compound day to day over time and can effectively be, in some instances in which they bug you in a small way over a long period of time, akin to the sort of torture where you slowly drip a small amount of water on someone uncomfortably over an extended period of time. Whether or not communication happens properly affects the healthiness of the relationship in the long run, can affect your later life as well if it goes particularly poorly, and so the impacts of this are just particularly huge. Second, logical priority. If we can ensure that relationships are healthy after the fact, then there is no need to be particularly interventionist in regards to the relationships that are entered, or for people to be able to smoothly leave those relationships. Third, it is just difficult to make changes to the relationship at this stage, and therefore it is important that we intervene so that people can make the necessary changes more easily. Why might leaving the relationship be the most important phase? The first reason is just because it is intensely difficult to do this, so it is particularly important to intervene to allow people out of relationships where they might be suffering from extreme sunk cost fallacy and stuff like that. Second, there's just the largest potential for harm and therefore the largest impact via mitigating awful harms of abusive relationships that get worse over time. Okay, abusive relationship section. Generally, it's worth noting that the vast majority of motions to do with relationships do not create abusive relationships. Rather, in some instances, they foster the conditions that can lead to people having bad communication, which leads to spirals, which over a long period of time could in some instances lead to abusive relationships, or sometimes they make it more or less difficult for people to leave those relationships, or they might make it harder or easier to hide abuse, this sort of thing. Make sure, especially since this is a very sensitive topic, that you're being nuanced about the arguments you're making. The first thing worth noting is just that the healthiness of relationships is not a constant. Relationships which both parties wish to keep as healthy can slide into unhealthiness if communication is not prioritized or partners aren't self-aware. So small frustrations often become larger conflicts when they are not named early, especially when partners fail to notice what bothers them, explain it clearly, or address it before resentment accumulates. And at that point, conversations that could have been collaborative often turn to a more adversarial nature. It becomes far easier for relationships to get worse than it is for them to get better, because it is quite difficult to combat that sort of thing. It changes your perception of the partner. You preemptively safeguard in the instance where this sort of thing occurs, and it is difficult to build back up the sort of deep trust and belief in your partner that is required for very healthy relationships. Abusive relationships are particularly hard to leave. There are many reasons for this. The first is just that abusers frequently socially isolate victims to the extent that it is difficult to reach out to people because you may have been told that they are out to get you. You may just be cut off from them as a result of your abuser doing this sort of thing. Second, you're often gaslit into not believing your own perspective. You're told that you're wrong, you're overreacting, that it's not that deep, that all of these things that you believe are plausibly abuse or plausibly not abuse are non-abusive of your partner. Third, you're frequently financially dependent on your partner. For very obvious reasons, abusive partners have strong incentives to induce some form of dependency, and for similar reasons, you're frequently emotionally dependent on your partner, especially in the instances in which you are socially isolated to the extent that you have no one else to talk to. This is a person you confide in, and even if they are bad to you and awful to you, it's still the person who you process your emotions to, who you're deeply emotionally invested in. Fifth, you might find ways over the long term to rationalize your abuse, which might decrease your want to get help in the first instance because you feel as though you deserve it, or maybe you think over the long term you figure out ways to convince yourself that it isn't a pattern of abuse, it's something else entirely, or it's not actually abusive. Sixth, you might feel like a duty to fix your partner. Seventh, you might believe that you are powerless to stop abuse as a result of learned helplessness. Eighth, you may always believe that you're on the verge of changing the relationship and making it a non-abusive relationship. Ninth, all of the standard barriers to leaving a relationship obviously exist. So, for example, sunk cost. You have frequently spent lots of time and money and emotional bandwidth invested in this person, and you don't want to leave them. You don't want those experiences to be justified. Frequently, it can be even more intense in these instances because you have done so much emotional justification for you staying in the relationship that as you go on, it's sort of a justification sunk cost fallacy where you continue to justify and you cannot override all of those years of justification for it. 10th, even when victims leave abusive relationships, they unfortunately often return as a result of resource constraints, fears about child custody, post-breakup depressive spirals, post-breakup loneliness, and maybe nostalgia or romanticizing the relationship that you are in because you feel bad and depressed now. Most of these will be true on either side of most motions. The primary difference in most relationship debates is how exposable abusive relationships are. So, how much external actors like police, like friends, like therapists, etc. will be able to see that abuse is happening, will be able to intervene in the situations. You can also sometimes make marginal but impactful arguments as to how easy it is to induce dependency on either side, or maybe leave in the least bad case instances. On that very, very happy note, that's all for today's workshop. I'll catch you tomorrow.